Assalamu alaikum, my dear students. My name is Chaudhary Musawwar Sharif Sandhu, a lecturer at the Department of Pakistan Studies, Virtual University of Pakistan. I hope all of you are doing great. In our previous lecture, we discussed about the concept of ideology and its significance. And in this lecture, we shall talk about the decline of Muslim rule in the subcontinent and War of Independence 1857. First of all, my dear students, we shall talk about the micro learning outcomes. इस लेक्चर के एख्तिताम पर आप जिन चीज़ों के बारे में सीखेंगे उनके बारे में मैं आपको आगाह करने जा रहा हूँ. Students will be able to identify the major causes behind the decline of Muslim rule in India. The second micro-learning outcome is to understand how internal weaknesses of the Mughal Empire contributed to the loss of Muslim political power. And the third micro-learning outcome is to analyze the social, religious, economic and political challenges faced by the Muslims after 1857 and their impact on Muslim identity. My dear students, first of all, we shall talk about the reasons of decline of Muslim rule in India. Basically, I have jotted down three reasons. The first one is internal decay of the Mughal Empire. The second one is the rise of the regional powers and external invasions. And the last but not least, the European colonial expansion and economic disruption. Now we shall discuss all these reasons one by one. Before that, the decline of the Muslim in India is a multifaceted historical process that significantly shaped the geopolitical landscape of the subcontinent, ultimately paving the way for British colonial dominance and the eventual partition of India. This complex period is crucial for understanding the ideological foundations that led to the creation of Pakistan. The collapse of Mughal Empire, internal weaknesses, and the rise of European powers collectively contributed to the erosion of Muslim political hegemony. Now, the first reason, that is internal decay of the Mughal Empire. The Mughal Empire, which had for centuries represented the zenith of Muslim power in India, began its irreversible decline after the death of Mughal Emperor Aurangzeb in 1707. While Aurangzeb's long reign from 1658 to 1707 saw the empire reach its greatest territorial extent, it also sowed the seeds of its disintegration. His policies, often perceived as religiously intolerant and economically demanding, alienated significant sections of the population, particularly the Marathas and Sikhs, leading to widespread rebellions and protracted warfare. These military campaigns, though initially successful in exceeding the empire's, severely strained its financial and administrative resources. Following Aurangzeb's death, a succession of weak and ineffective emperors ascended the throne, leading to a rapid fragmentation of central authority. The Mughal court became a hotbed of intrigue and factionalism, with powerful nobles and regional governors increasingly asserting their independence. This internal instability was exacerbated by the Jagirdari crisis, where the demand for land assignments outstripped their availability, leading to corruption, reduced loyalty, and a decline of administrative efficiency. Military discipline also deteriorated as emperors relied on mercenary armies whose loyalty was often fleeting. Key provinces like Bengal, Awadh, and Hyderabad gradually became de facto independent states, acknowledging Mughal suzerainty only in name. This decentralization of power effectively dismantled the unified administrative structure that had been a hallmark of Mughal rule. The second reason, that is, the rise of regional powers and external invasions. As the Mughal central authority weakened, various regional powers emerged, challenging the remnants of Muslim dominance. The Marathas, under dynamic leader like Shivji and later the Peshwas, expanded their influence across central and western India, frequently raiding Mughal territories and establishing a formidable confederacy. Their continuous military pressure further depleted Mughal resources and prestige. Similarly, Sikhs in Punjab, the Jats around Delhi, and the Rajputs in Rajasthan asserted their autonomy, contributing to the fragmentation of political power. Compounding these internal challenges were devastating external invasions. The most significant of these was the invasion by Nadir Shah of Persia in 1739, which culminated in the sack of Delhi. This invasion not only plundered immense wealth from the Mughal treasury, but also shattered the myth of Mughal invincibility, exposing the empire's vulnerability to external aggression. It also led to the loss of significant territories in the northwest. Following Nader Shah, Ahmad Shah Abdali, the Afghan ruler, launched a series of invasions, further weakening the Mughal state and contributing to the chaos in northern India. These invasions, my dear students, not only destroyed existing infrastructure and economies but also prevented any coherent revival of centralized Muslim power. Another reason, that is the European colonial expansion and economic disruption. Dear students, simultaneously with the internal decay and regional challenges, European trading companies, particularly the British East India Company, began to transition from mere commercial enterprise to formidable political and military powers. Initially seeking trade concessions, these companies exploited the political fragmentation of India. They forged alliances with regional rulers, often playing them against each other, and gradually built their own armies. Key battles marked the ascendancy of British power. The Battle of Plassey in 1757, where the British East India Company, led by Robert Clive, decisively defeated the Nawab of Bengal, Sirajuddaula, marked a turning point. This victory gave the British control over Bengal, a rich and populous province, providing them with significant revenue and resources. Subsequent victories, such as Battle of Boxer in 1764, further solidified British dominance, granting them the right to collect revenue in Bengal, Bihar, and Orissa. Anglo-Mysore Wars and Anglo-Maratha Wars progressively eliminated other powerful regional contenders, effectively establishing British dominance across the subcontinent. The British colonial economic policies further disrupted the traditional Indian economy, which had supported the Mughal aristocracy and Muslim artisans. The imposition of new land revenue systems, the decline of indigenous industries due to competition from British manufactured goods, and the overall exploitation of resources led to widespread impoverishment and disempowerment, particularly affecting Muslim elite who had historically benefited from state patronage and land grants. My dear students, now we shall talk about the War of Independence 1857. The year 1857 marks a massive turning point in the history of Indian subcontinent. The students of Pakistan's history trying to understand the why behind the creation of Pakistan. This event is essential starting point, often called the War of Independence by the South Asian historians or the Sepoy Mutiny by the British historians. The events of 1857 were a violent and dramatic end to one era and the beginning of another. To understand the decline of Muslim political power and the eventual struggle for Pakistan, we must first understand the watershed event of 1857. My dear students, now we shall discuss the causes of the War of Independence 1857. The immediate cause: why did the soldiers revolt? The rebellion did not begin as a coordinated struggle for freedom, but as a mutiny in the army of the British East India Company. The famous and immediate cause was the introduction of new Enfield rifle. The cartridges for this rifle were greased with animal fat, and soldiers had to bite the end off to load the weapon. A rumor spread like wildfire among the Sepoy Indian soldiers that the grease were made from a mixture of a cow and pig fat. For Hindu soldiers, the cow was sacred; for Muslim soldiers, the pig was unclean. This was a direct attack on the religious beliefs of both communities. The British had for years tried to respect the religious practices of its soldiers, but this one act of insensitivity convinced many Sepoys that the British were trying to destroy their faith and convert them to Christianity. This fear was spark that ignited the tinderbox of accumulated grievances. Now, the long term causes. While the greased cartridges were the spark, the fire was fueled by decades of political, economic, social, and religious discontent. Political causes. My dear students, British East India Company expanded its control through the war of diplomacy for a century. But the policies of Governor-General Lord Dalhousie in the 1850s proved particularly inflammatory. The doctrine of lapse allowed the British to annex princely states where rulers died without natural male heirs, leading to seizure of Sitara, Jhansi, and Nagpur. Indian rulers viewed this as a betrayal of established succession customs. In 1856, the British annexed the wealthy kingdom of Awadh on the charges of misgovernment, directly alienating the many spoils who originated from this region and remained loyal to its Nawab. Simultaneously, the British dismantled the traditional power structure of the Mughal court and Maratha Empire, creating a class of displaced princes and nobles eager to reclaim their lost authority. The second cause is economic. Economic causes. The British colonial exploitation systematically drained Indian wealth through heavy taxation and discriminatory trade policies. The permanent settlement and rigid revenue demands devastated agricultural communities, while the destruction of indigenous industries, particularly textiles, deprived millions of artisans of their livelihoods. The annexation of prosperous states like Awadh disrupted regional economies and threatened the economic security of military families. For spoils, British policies regarding service conditions, and pensions created direct financial insecurities, making rebellion an economically rational choice for many participants. Another cause is about the social conditions. Growing fears of westernization dominated Indian society as the British imposed alien cultural values through administrative and educational reforms. Legislation banning sati and permitting widow remarriage was perceived as unwarranted interference in sacred traditions. The promotion of English education and Western legal concepts alienated traditional elites who felt their cultural identity was under systematic assault. These reforms undermined the authority of community leaders and created defensive reaction among those determined to preserve their social hierarchies and family structures. The last but not least, the religious causes. A pervasive fear existed that the British aimed to Christianize India, fueled by increasing missionary activities and government support for Christian education. As historian Aisha Jalal notes, Muslim leaders invoked jihad against British rule, viewing it as a threat to Islam. This religious dimension transformed political anger into sacred cause. Crucially, the shared perception of religious endangerment created unprecedented unity between Hindus and Muslims, who traditionally experienced tensions but now found common cause against a regime hostile to both faiths, providing a unifying ideology that sustained coordinated resistance. Now, my dear students, we shall talk about the course of war. The mutiny began on May 10th, 1857 in Meerut. Spoils who had been imprisoned for refusing to use the new cartridges were freed by their comrades. The rebels then marched to Delhi, the symbolic heart of India. In Delhi, they turned to aging Mughal Emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar and declared him their leader. This was a powerful symbolic act, as it revived the notion of a Mughal empire fighting to expel the British. The rebellion spread rapidly across northern and central India. For example, in Kanpur, the leader Nana Sahib led the rebel forces. In Jhansi, the legendary Rani Lakshmi Bai, whose state had been annexed by the British, became a military commander and a symbol of resistance. In Awadh, Begum Hazrat Mahal took the reins of the rebellion. For a brief period, my dear students, Hindus and Muslims, princes and peasants united against a common enemy. This unity was remarkable. As one historian notes, the revolt symbolized collective identity, cutting across caste, class, and communal divisions. It was a moment when an idea of India based on shared patriotism seemed possible. However, this unity was not enough. The British had superior resources, better communication, and crucial support from some Indian princes and groups. For example, the powerful Sikh princes of Punjab and the ruler of Hyderabad, Mysore, and Kashmir remained loyal to the British and provided them with soldiers. The rebellion was brutally suppressed by mid 1858. Delhi was recaptured, Bahadur Shah Zafar was exiled, and the Rani of Jhansi was killed in battle. Dear students, now we shall talk about पोस्ट 1857 सिनेरियो कि 1857 की जंग आज़ादी के बाद क्या हुआ और फिर ब्रिटिश राज कैसे इस्टेब्लिश हुआ. Dear students, the failure of the War of Independence had catastrophic consequences, especially for Muslims of India. For example, it was for example, the end of East India Company. The British government realized that the company's rule was a failure. In 1858, the British Crown took direct control of India, an era known as the British Raj. The Queen Victoria was declared Empress of India. The policy of vengeance and suspicion also started in this particular phase. The British were determined to punish those they held responsible. Muslims were singled out for particular suspicion. The British believed that the Muslims were primary instigators of the rebellion, कि जैसे ये rebellion मुसलमानों ने ही सिर्फ की थी और इसमें कोई और community शामिल ही नहीं थी, as they were trying to restore the old Mughal order. ब्रिटिशर्स को ये लगा कि मुसलमान वापस पुराने वाला सिस्टम दोबारा चाहते हैं, इसलिए उन्होंने ये म्यूटनी या ये वॉर ऑफ इंडिपेंडेंस स्टार्ट की. As Ahmad Said argues, the aftermath was a disaster for the Muslim community. They were systematically removed from positions of power and authority. Their property was confiscated and they were excluded from army and government services. The War of Independence of 1857 was a watershed moment. It was the final doomed attempt of old India to resist the new colonial power. For Muslims, it marked the end of centuries of political dominance and the beginning of a long struggle for survival in their own homeland. The despair and decline that followed 1857 created the conditions for a new kind of politics. Thinkers like Sir Syed Ahmad Khan would emerge from this wreckage, urging the Muslims community to reconcile with the British, embrace modern education, and chart a new path to protect their identity. Thus, the story of Pakistan's creation begins not with the celebration of victory in 1857 but with the painful lesson of its defeat. My dear students, now we shall talk about the social, religious, economic and political challenges after War of Independence 1857. After the War of Independence in 1857, the Muslims of India found themselves in a state of deep crisis. They had lost their political power, their economic strength, and their social standing. However, the most difficult battle they faced was one on the socio-religious front. The challenges were not simply about poverty or lack of jobs. They went much deeper into question of faith, identity, and survival. This section explores the major socio-religious challenges that Muslims had to confront in the late 19th century. The crisis of identity and psychological defeat. Dear students, the most fundamental challenge facing Muslims after 1857 was a crisis of identity. For centuries, Muslims had ruled large parts of India. With the exile of the last Mughal emperor Bahadur Shah Zafar, the symbol of Muslim political authority was destroyed forever. The community found itself leaderless and directionless. This created a deep psychological defeat. Muslims experienced a trauma of defeat, going from rulers to subjects. The British deliberately targeted Muslims for punishment, confiscating property and excluding them from government employment. This systematic persecution deepened the sense of despair and humiliation. The psychological challenge was worsened by rapid social change from the West. The Muslims were deeply divided on how to respond. Should they reject Western, everything Western, or accept modernity completely? Now, the second thing was educational backwardness and intellectual stagnation. My dear students, the most serious practical challenge was educational backwardness. Before 1857, Muslims relied on traditional Islamic education. After British rule, English replaced Persian as the official language, and a modern education system was introduced. Most Muslims refused to attend British schools. They saw English education as a tool of Christian missionaries and believed it would corrupt Islamic values. While understandable, this rejection had disastrous consequences. While other communities embraced English education and filled government jobs, Muslims lagged far behind. By the 1870s, Muslims were severely underrepresented in the government, law, and commerce. Without modern education, Muslims could not participate in public debates, influence policies, or represent their interests. They were becoming irrelevant in their own homeland. My dear students, the next challenge was on the economic front. The economic decline and the destruction of Muslim middle class. The economic challenge was closely connected to educational backwardness. Before 1857, the Muslim upper class and middle classes depended on government services, land ownership, and traditional crafts. British policies after the rebellion systematically destroyed these sources of income. The British confiscated properties of suspected Muslims. Ahmad Said describes how Muslim nobles were reduced to poverty overnight. कैसे एक ही दिन के अंदर उनको गुर्बत में धकेल दिया गया. Wiping out traditional aristocracy. Furthermore, new legal and economic systems favored those who understood English. Muslims who had rejected English education could not compete. Traditional crafts declined against British machine made goods. The community was trapped in a cycle of poverty and backwardness. Without education, they could not get jobs. Without jobs, they could not afford education. This decline threatened the community's survival as a respectable entity. My dear students, the next challenge that Muslims faced at that time was of religious fears and the threat of Christian missionaries. Perhaps the most emotional challenge was the fear that Islam itself was under attack. After 1857, Christian missionaries became more active. Often with British support, they established schools, distributed religious literature, and openly criticized Islam. Aisha Jalal discusses how Muslim fears of conversion were very real. Many believed the British used education to convert children. Rumors suggested the government planned to interfere with Muslim personal law. These fears were not unreasonable, as some British officials hoped India would become Christian. The introduction of Western education and customs seemed like a systematic effort to destroy Indian religions. This religious insecurity created immense anxiety, with parents afraid to send children to school and leaders struggling to protect Islamic beliefs. Dear student, another challenge was the challenge of disunity and conflicting responses. Finally, the Muslim community faced the internal challenge of disunity. Different groups proposed conflicting solutions, creating divisions rather than cooperation. Some religious scholars argued for completely rejecting British rule and preserving traditional learning. Others believed Muslims must learn English and adopt modern ways to survive. Still others tried to find a middle path. This confusion made it difficult to present a united front for Muslim interests. The absence of strong leadership was a major challenge. The traditional Mughal leaders were destroyed, and religious scholars had limited practical power. There was no single voice to guide the community through the crisis. My dear students, to conclude this lecture, the decline of Muslim rule in India, culminating in the 1857 War of Independence, represents a watershed moment that fundamentally transformed the subcontinent's political landscape. The internal decay of Mughal Empire, characterized by weak successors, administrative fragmentation, and devastating external invasions, progressively dismantled centuries of Muslim political hegemony. The 1857 uprising, while briefly uniting Hindu and Muslim against colonial rule, ended in catastrophic failure that disproportionately devastated the Muslim community. The British singled out Muslims for systematic punishment, abolishing Mughal Empire, confiscating properties, and excluding them from positions of power. This political destruction was compounded by profound socio-religious challenges: educational backwardness, economic decline, psychological defeat, and fear of religious extinction under missionary pressure. The community found itself leaderless, impoverished, and politically irrelevant in its own homeland. This period of unprecedented crisis from rulers to subjects created the collective trauma and identity consciousness that would ultimately catalyze the movement for Muslim revival and the demand for a separate state. Dear students, we have also placed a list of recommended books for further readings or for further studies, so you may download any of the books that is related to the topic from the LMS download section. A list of the books is available over there. Thank you so much for listening to the lectures very patiently. Thank you once again.